Joining us via Skype is political analyst Dan Glazebrook. Dan, thank you for joining us. Now, the EU are increasing their humanitarian efforts towards Syria. Why now? Is this to do with the threat of homegrown terror?
I don't think it's so much to do with that. I think it's the fact that the policy that's been pursued over the last 3.5 years by US, Britain, and their allies is just manifestly not working in Syria. They've failed to dislodge the Syrian government. And interestingly, I think with this recent announcement of a humanitarian ceasefire, so-called in Aleppo, I think they're realizing that their forces are being have been for a lot of the year defeated on the ground. There's obviously been a slight turnaround with ISIS after the taking of Mosul and the raiding of Mosul's banks. But I think that they're also worried about the initiative passing now to, if you remember this, the successful ceasefire and evacuation of the last fighters from Homs earlier in the year was organized by Russia and Iran. And obviously they're very worried about if the side that they're supporting, the so-called Free Syrian Army, is starting to get exhausted and seek some kind of ceasefire and political settlement, which Britain and the US have always lobbied against and actually tried to sabotage in the past, any attempts at a peaceful resolution. But if their own fighters are now looking to some kind of negotiated way out of these various battles, they're worried they don't want the initiative for organizing that to go to Russia and Iran and to actually boost the forces of the global south, that this whole proxy war was designed to destabilize in the first place. So I think that's why we're seeing now this kind of newfound sudden desire for some sort of ceasefire and political negotiated settlement on the part of the very powers who've been pushing for the exact opposite for the past 3.5 years.
Now, we know that France and the US are backing so-called moderate opposition groups in Syria. Will this make the EU's role irrelevant at all?
Well, yeah. Again, you know, Britain and the US and France may not have actually switched their strategy of trying to sabotage any kind of negotiated agreements. We still may see this happening. I mean, the UN, the UN's attempts in the past to negotiate between the two sides in Syria, or the various sides, I should say, have been sabotaged by Britain in particular, I should say, in the past. With Britain, you know, announcing that it was going to send weapons to the opposition just at the time when there was possible calls from within the opposition for a peaceful settlement. With Britain's key allies like Saudi Arabia saying they were going to start funding the fighters just as they began to run out of resources, and again looked like a negotiated settlement might be less necessary. So yeah, we're not out of the woods yet for sure, and these kind of things could well be scuppered, as they have done in the past, by the sources that are supporting destabilization strategy, namely Britain, France, and the US.
But do you think it is realistic for fighting to stop if there is this continued funding of these groups?
Obviously, the funding doesn't help, but at the end of the day, it's the people on the ground making those individual decisions to continue fighting who are becoming increasingly exhausted, disillusioned, and just weary of this battle that I think it's increasingly clear that they're not going to win, and that there is no way out of other than a political settlement. So you know, and increasingly it's becoming polarized now. You talk about the moderate opposition. This whole idea was really partly an illusion, I think, from the start. The idea of this sort of moderate armed opposition, for one thing, to take up weapons and go and kill as many police and soldiers as you can find. When it happens on the streets of Britain, it's not considered moderate. I don't know why Cameron and Hague and their allies think that that's something moderate to do in Syria.
That's a very good point.
It's not moderate, and the weapons increasingly do end up in the hands of fighters like ISIS, and it's these groups who are taking the upper hand in the fighting now. The kind of so-called middle ground is kind of evaporating, really.
Dan, if I might just interrupt there, I'm sorry, but we've only got a short amount of time. Only last year we know that some EU members were considering joining the war on Syria. Now, what's behind this change in policy?
Well, again, as I say, one thing I'm not convinced there is a complete change of policy. We may yet, as I said, see Britain and France working behind the scenes and perhaps even overtly to scupper, sabotage the negotiations as they have done in the past. But secondly, if there is any kind of, if they do swing their support behind UN proposals for negotiated settlement, that must be seen, I think, in the light of two things. One, the exhaustion of their proxy forces on the ground, who are themselves increasingly starting to seek these kind of solutions. And secondly, and as a result of that, the fear that they don't want this kind of settlement to be overseen by Russia and Iran, who would then gain credibility out of the process.
Thank you, Dan Glazebrook, for joining us today.